Yes, like was said, my name's Ian. I'm a senior software engineer in the BBC, and I work in BBC Platform. And BBC Platform basically you can think of as the part of the BBC that provides all the backend services to like the user-facing products. So things like iPlayer will get the data from us, Sport will get their information from us as well, news, so on. All of those kind of user-facing products will get information from BBC Platform's backend services. And I'm going to talk about a journey from messy code duplication across UIs to a collaborative component library. So split this into a few chapters, and the first chapter is the origins, so how we got started on this endeavor. And to do that, I need to give you a brief life story. So bear with me while I do this. So I've been a developer since 2012, and I started off mostly working on creating HTML and CSS templates in the front end. And I did a bit of working on Drupal sites with PHP. But really, I wanted to be working on single page applications written with JavaScript. I found these roles quite limited, and I wanted to get involved in the full stack and the full UI experience. So I wanted to write using JavaScript frameworks like React, and there was all sorts at the time, Ember and Angular and so on. And so I applied to the BBC, and after a couple of applications, I got a job as a senior web developer in the iSight team, which is a team that developed a content management system. And it was awesome. I felt on top of the world, like this guy. This is Trevor Lawrence. He was the #1 overall pick for the NFL draft, which if you don't know about sports or NFL, that's a really big deal. He must have been, you can tell by that smile, he must have been top of the world when he got that. And I felt similarly when I got this job at the BBC. So it was awesome. And I couldn't wait to get started. And my first task at the BBC was on this content management system called iSight, and it was extending the scheduled publish functionality through the CMS. And we needed a date picker to choose the date that you want to publish on, and a time picker to say what time you wanted to publish. And so I set about developing that. I researched the market for NPM, the NPM market for date pickers as a sort of start to see what was out there and where I could go. I then developed the time picker aspect myself without a library. And this all kind of took, I think it's quite generous actually saying 1 month, it might have been a bit more than that, about a month from ticket to live. So, first task done, feeling pretty good. Then a few weeks later, I was having lunch with some other teams, a couple of members of other teams, and it kind of came up in conversation that another team had just developed a similar date picker on their application. And this got me thinking. I thought, oh gosh, right, they've done the same thing I've done, and there's loads of developers here at the BBC. There's around, I found this out later, that there are at least 30 product teams developing internal tools. So things like this CMS that I was on a team for. And I thought, if another team that I know about has developed something similar, how many of those other 30 teams doing something similar? I thought, gosh, that doesn't seem great. How can we coordinate some reuse? So I started off by thinking, what sharing is going on there at the moment? Someone else must have come across this. There must be some endeavors to share code already. And there was one particular project called GEL, which is the Global Experience Language. And that was a really good project for sharing components that are on user-facing websites. So things like news and sport that I mentioned earlier, they had a shared component library. But it was a bit limited for our needs on internal tools. It didn't have things like date pickers and time pickers, because you don't really need those on the user-facing products. We also found a thing called Grandstand, which was BBC Sport's extension of the GEL framework. So creating a BBC Sport flavor on the components offered by the GEL UI framework. And there was iPlayer web components as well, which was an iPlayer extension of the GEL framework. All things that were really great, but didn't really fit our needs as the team that developed internal tools for journalists and so on. So we needed to do something different. There was nothing really for us. So what did we do? we started out by creating a component library for internal tools. It sounds obvious, but that was kind of what we wanted to try and achieve. And our first aim was to reduce duplication in our own team. So we wanted to start small. We knew there were loads of other teams, but we thought, right, let's start with our own estate. We had this iSight CMS, but we had a couple of other UIs as well. And even across those UIs owned by our own team, we were rewriting code, and we wanted to cut that out first. And then we thought we'd take it to the wider dev teams. Didn't know how many there were at the time. Didn't know how tall an order that was. But we wanted to reduce duplication in our team, then try and do it across multiple teams. And then if we could get support from the UX team as well, to help us develop and choose UI components that could be reused across lots of other teams. So that was the goal. And who is the we? That's probably quite important to explain. Who am I talking about when I say we? Well, there were 3 senior web developers in our team. There was one very supportive product owner on the team who was very happy for us to put time into this. There was a UX designer embedded in the team who was great to help us set some of the standards around these reusable components. And there was a BA who was also very supportive. So that was the endeavor. And the next part really to talk about is the tech journey. So how did we go about implementing this? And we had a number of attempts. Some of them were successful, some of them less so. So I'll talk through those attempts. So attempt number 1, we started off by creating a repository. It seems like an obvious place to start as well, but we needed to write some code for a reusable component. So we thought, right, let's have a centralized repository where everything can live. We had an idea of the components that we wanted to reuse because we'd looked at our own UIs and we'd selected a few candidates. And so you can see on the right there, we wrote all our components in one folder called reactions. We kind of ported code from our existing applications into this central place. Wrote all the code in one place, pulled it all into an index.js file, which is this one, and then distributed it all as a bundle. So you could pull in all these components as a big bundle and reuse them. You might be spotting some flaws with this already, but I'll go on to those. So we had a simple build process for this, which was really good. That was a positive. We had an 87-line Webpack file. For those of you who know Webpack, that is very small. Webpack files can get insanely big. So that was good. It was a nice, simple build process because everything was kind of in that one place. We pulled all the components into a bundle, like I say, and distributed them all together as for use on client apps. And that sentence there is kind of related to the issue, which I'm going to point out in a second. So the big issue with this was that we had no way to version individual components. So this is what a client application might have. It's pulling in the library of all the components called internal gel matter. I wish we'd chosen a different name, not best name. But anyway, you pull in all the components as one. And that gave us a problem because you couldn't update individual components. You had to pull in the updates to all of the components if there were any updates. So say we updated the date picker and you wanted to get the latest version of the date picker on your client application, you have to update all of the other components as well. And if there are breaking changes in those, you'd have to integrate those breaking changes, which is obviously really annoying. And that was a showstopper. So it was a decent start, but we knew that we needed to change that. So we attempted something else. And the key problem we were trying to solve was how do we distribute each component individually? Well, unfortunately, we couldn't use NPM. And that was because we couldn't use the open source NPM because at the BBC, there's quite a lot of process involved to open source something. And these components didn't really feel like they were belonged as open source components anyway, because they are very specific to our internal tools. So we decided not to go down the open source NPM route. We didn't have a NPM org to publish to privately. So NPM offers you a way to publish private packages, but we didn't have that. You have to pay for that. Didn't have it. Like I say, we needed a free solution. So we couldn't use NPM, which was a shame because that's the obvious tool for packaging up JavaScript. So what we ended up doing was creating a new Git repository to distribute each component. And the idea was we'd keep all the source code in the central repository with the build scripts that would optimize the code, and then we'd publish the distributed code to each individual components Git repository, so that you could then pull in each component individually, and we could update each individual component separately in the distributed files. So that worked quite well. And it also gave us a tool to create an individual README for each component. So you can see on the left here, this was a dialog component. This is a very basic README with a bit of example usage, but we were able to provide a bit more documentation by doing this. And on the right, you can see all of the different versions. So users could go in and pull different versions and different updates, which is good. So we solved that problem of not being able to update individual components. And this is kind of reiterating what I just said. So we solved the versioning problem, which was great. It gave us a mechanism to document component usage. But on the downside, there were quite a lot of quite a lot of complicated scripts to build and publish to each of the different repositories. There was kind of manual tasks if you needed to set up a new repository as well. Importantly, we couldn't make use of dynamic versioning through this. So clients had to tie themselves to a specific version. They couldn't say, I want this version and all the bug fixes that are introduced, or I want this version and all the minor minor feature releases as well. So they'd have to update that manually, which was a bit annoying. It's not the way we wanted to do things, but it was workable. The app admins at BBC weren't too happy because we had a hard limit on Git repositories in our Git contract. So we just basically set something up that would create loads and loads of repositories. But it worked well enough. Like I say, it worked well enough. We were able to develop multiple components and scale the library, which was awesome. And we started to see the benefits of the shared components on new projects for ourselves. When we had a new project to work on, we could pull in all of the components that we'd written already into that new project. And that really did help get new projects up and running, which was awesome. And at this stage, we began to tentatively talk to other teams to get their feedback and see whether this was something that would work for them. And we were kind of nudging ourselves towards that second goal of taking this externally. And then iPlayer came along with some money, because they have lots of money at the BBC, and they bought an NPM license or a set of NPM licenses, and it introduced an opportunity for us. We were able to use NPM now suddenly. So there were some creases with that GitHub approach that we could iron out. And so we took the opportunity to do that. So we had our third attempt at implementing this technically. Like I say, we wanted to make some improvements. We wanted to save some time on building the scripts, building the components, and we had an opportunity to do that through NPM. It also meant we could make use of dynamic versioning, which is something I mentioned earlier. So we can now publish the packages in a way that clients could pull in bug fixes and so on. And with this, we could also improve our monorepo management through Yarn workspaces. I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. But our monorepo, where we had all the source code, was getting a bit out of hand. And we were able to improve that as part of this work. And we were able to reduce the management overhead by removing all the scripts to publish to different repositories. There's quite a few scripts to create Git repositories, update them, publish to them, and that whole sort of build process was simplified by using NPM. And this has nothing to do with NPM, but we saw an opportunity to improve our documentation further by introducing Storybook. And I'll show you Storybook a bit later on. It's a great open source tool to document reusable components. So these were kind of our next improvements, another iteration to how we've done this component library. Here's just a bit of a screenshot of it. You can see us now publishing directly to our private NPM package. This is on the right hand side. This is a screenshot from the npm website. You can see our different components going in. And then on the left there, that's an example of a client pulling in different versions of different components. And you can see in the package JSON, they've specified, like, I think this is called a tilde, which will basically say, give me all the bug fixes to the button as they're released. And this one here, I think it's called a caret, not 100% sure. That's saying, give me the minor updates to the dialog. So that was cool that we could implement that. And as I said, we use Yarn workspaces, introduced Yarn workspaces, and this solved a big problem that was emerging around dependencies for the components themselves. So just to give an example, we had a search field component and a modal component, and without Yarn workspaces, all their dependencies would have to be exactly the same version. So you couldn't have something like this where a search field has a different version of the class names package to the IGN modal. They'd both have to use the same dependency package, which was really annoying, especially if you just wanted to work on the modal and you're saying, and you wanted to update or introduce a new dependency for the modal. You couldn't do that. You'd have to use the version that was already being used across all the other components, and that was a pain. So with Yarn workspaces, you can do that. It will magically handle these dependencies for you, the different versions of the dependencies for you. And it allows you to have components with different dependency versions, which was really important. It might seem trivial with the case of class names, but it was actually quite important for things like where the components depended on other components in the component library, like the button. Button was used in a lot of our other components. And through this, we were able to depend on different versions of it, which was super helpful for maintainability of the package. And we implemented a proper demo with Storybook. So this is where I'm actually going to show you what we've done rather than talk about it. So I'm going to switch to a browser here. This is Storybook. On the left, you can see a big list of all our components. And I'm going to show you the modal, for example. And if I click into the modal there, I can start playing around with it. I can interact with it there, and it will show me what I get. I'll close that down. And then down here, you have some basic options like a size. And this is a prop that's passed through to the component. So Storybook is a great way to showcase functionality. Just to give you another example, we have an input, which seems like quite a simple thing to have as a reusable component. But the idea here is that all the styles will be consistent across all our applications. There's a search option. There's one with some info in it, one with the reset as well. So you can see all the different options through Storybook, one with an error and so on. So this was great. It gave us a good opportunity to showcase our components, and that really helped for kind of trying to onboard other teams to use this stuff. So speaking of onboarding, the third chapter in this story is the evangelism. How do we spread this idea? We found out that actually technically solving a problem is the easy bit. Convincing other teams and other engineers to get involved with your project and then it's a good endeavor is the really hard bit. So I'll talk a bit about that now. So before we went out and tried to get other people involved and try and share these components across other teams, we had a bit of a think about what our key messages were to go out with. What was our kind of agenda, I suppose. So firstly, we were going to say we want to reduce duplication of effort. We've written some components based on our designs. Use it if you can. So it was really light touch. It was basically saying like, here's a set of components in npm. If they look good and if you want to use them and they match your designs, and just pull them in like any other open source package, and away you go, use them. The second message was, say you wanted to contribute. Our team will act as admins, and we'll review pull requests, and we'll release updates to components ourselves. We'll kind of be the gatekeepers. But also we're super keen for contributions. You're very welcome to make contributions, but don't overthink the reuse was a key message, really. It's very easy to get bogged down in thinking, oh, I wonder how another team's going to use this component. Maybe I should make this a prop. Maybe I should make that a prop. The key thing is not to overthink that. You can always make something a property later on, or change how you've done it. Cater for your needs now, and then making it reusable is something that can be added later. It's good to keep half an eye on it, but don't overthink it. Is the key message. And don't hesitate to, link to that point. Don't hesitate to customize things that you see. If a component doesn't do exactly what you need, feel free to extend it. So we tried to get that word out. We used our local networks. And what I mean by that is we spoke to teams physically near us when we used to be in buildings, which was one tactic. We spoke to development teams that we were collaborating on certain projects. And that was a good way to get some buy-in. And by doing that, we actually got our first contribution. This was a big moment. That's why this face is so smiley. Back in 2018, we got the makings of that input component that I showed you. We had a contribution from one of the teams we worked with, which was awesome. We'd finally got some buy-in from another team. We wanted to keep going, obviously. So we had some other tactics. We sent out envoys. So one great envoy sort of scheme that we had was the graduate scheme. So this is a great thing. The graduate scheme at the BBC is a 2-year scheme, and graduates have 4 6-month rotations. So it was just enough time for a graduate to join our team, for us to indoctrinate them into this way of thinking, and then send them out to other teams to indoctrinate them and get them on board as well. And that was really effective. Our BA unfortunately left the team, but did head to a new team in Salford, and she got them really interested in the project and on board with the project, which was great. And we had some architects, some floating architects that would work across lots of teams who were able to promote it through their contacts too. We did some internal tech talks, much like this, but just to the BBC audience. BBC's got a great culture for show and tells. And so that was a good opportunity to share the word across other teams as well. What we didn't have, though, was a top-down push. So we don't really have the structure, or didn't have the structure in BBC platform at all, where you have like a head of engineering and all the team leads, engineering team leads reporting to him, and then all the engineers reporting to those team leads. We didn't have anything like that. So there was no easy way of giving like that department-wide message down to all the teams. That was a bit of a challenge and a bit of a shame. So we couldn't do it that way. We had to do it all by kind of convincing people it was a good idea. And it was hard. It was difficult to get buy-in. There's a bit of a not invented here culture at times that we battled against, where people were naturally skeptical of something that they hadn't developed. There was a fear that writing generic components and contributing to this library would add a lot of extra work for teams. And there was a concern about the support burden of any contributions. So basically concern about adding to workload rather than saving time. And crucially, there was no dedicated team on this. So this was a best efforts endeavor by, like I say, the iSight team and a few other contributors. There was no dedicated resource. So the question was, what if people left? Who would maintain it? But by 2019, it reached a good place. We had 49 contributors to the project. We had an active Slack channel with well over 100 people in it. We had lots of components, lots of new components that covered a vast amount of the kind of reusable tasks you'd want to do on a UI. So it was in a really good place. One thing we didn't have, unfortunately, is like stats on weekly downloads. With private NPM packages, you don't get that, which is a shame. So we didn't actually know how many projects this was being used on. You could do a bit of a GitHub search, which was a way of doing it, but there was no real accurate download stats, which is a shame. So the final chapter, really, and this is, I've only got a few minutes left. This is what happened next, and where it is now, I suppose. So in 2019, I left BBC. I was one of the admins on the project, and the other admin who had kind of worked alongside me a lot, one of the initial creators of the project also left. So, you know, maybe people's fears were being realized of the support burden and this thing dwindling. But we handed it over to the digital publishing team, who was another team we'd been working with closely a lot. They were one of the first teams to get on board with this project. But the question kind of remained, would they have the time and enthusiasm to keep the project going? But I actually rejoined a year later after leaving. And I found there'd been huge improvements to the library, actually. So I found it in a better place than when I left, which was really awesome. And it made me think maybe I was holding it back all those years. But it was great to see that there were some big improvements and the project was thriving. So one thing that had really changed since I left was there was some close collaboration with UX, which was awesome to see. So one of our big challenges was that we were kind of just identifying components based on what us as developers thought could be reusable. But the big change was that UX were now saying, here is a component that we think is reusable. We're going to put this in lots of our designs. So it'd be great to get a component developed for it, which was a real big improvement. There were lots of new components added. And another really crucial thing is that the digital publishing team had done a great job of improving accessibility across all the components. We'd been a bit lax on that when we set it up. So that was a real big, awesome improvement. And I haven't really mentioned CSS at all, but we were using Sass when we set this all up. And in that time, that year, style components had been implemented, styled components, which actually made managing the CSS much easier. That was a good improvement to see as well. But to this day, it's still a best efforts project. It still relies on developers from a non-dedicated team working on the project and maintaining it. And it is active and it is doing well. But that is something that perhaps could hold it back a little bit. And I think that's everything. Yep, that's me done. So thanks very much for listening.